Hey, folks. Can you hear
Hello,
me okay?
good morning. Yep, or good afternoon.
The
We
salsa
hear you.
positioning meeting notes is an owner's trash.
What?
Yeah. What is this? I don't know what that means. I know some of the Google Docs were going into an OpenSSF, like Google Share or something. So I'm wondering if that's what it is.
Do we have the same link?
Yeah, somebody can, let me go to the calendar.
I just dropped you the one that I've got.
Okay, thank you. Check. Oh, silly me. Yeah, I'm in the really old one, the salsa positioning. I typed in positioning in my tab in my search bar, and that's the one that came up first. So
Okay.
just click. Yeah. So sorry, I scared myself. Thank you.
Mystery solved, panic averted.
Yes. Okay, so let me copy this, and apologies for not having done this. It's been a full day, 2 presentations, a retrospective, a stand-up, and not even had a chance to think. Today is July 12th. And Brandon, since you're here, oh, Mike is here too. And I know Marcella and Jay are booked, so they are not coming. And then Bruno, since I'm already here. Is it with a Z or an S? S, okay. Hey. So before we start, does anybody have any topics that they wanted to discuss? I know no one's new here. Okay. So was anybody at the TAC yesterday, the TAC meeting? I think it went well for the SCI working group. So if someone's able to give an update, that would be great. Because that recording probably won't be out for at least a week, maybe. Nobody was there.
I wasn't there. I did read the notes.
Yeah, I wasn't there. I didn't read the I did read the notes, and a few of the other folks who were there largely said like the supply chain integrity stuff is good. I think which is one of the comments I had heard from folks, but it's tangential purely to this, is they're like, there's so much stuff in the OpenSSF now that it's really hard to sort of like know, like, wait a second, like, what is supply chain integrity working group working on that makes it different than, the securing, critical projects working group, or, some of that stuff, which I think that's more of like a TAC problem and a general OpenSSF problem than our problem.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. Oh, thank you, whoever, anonymous goose. I don't know who's doing that, but I appreciate
Got a goose day. Nice.
Yeah. There's an anonymous wombat and then anonymous goose. Yeah, I think I tried to read through the notes, but it didn't really say anything. It just said, the SCI working group presentation or update, and then I gave a link to the slides, which we read ahead of time. So I was curious about any of the conversations that were happening live that weren't necessarily captured. So, but it seems like you know, they weren't anti what we're doing. Otherwise, I think it would have been documented. But I do think there's some working groups that have things like the supply chain attack framework, right? Why is that in a different working group, and why isn't that in SCI working group, right? So that's something that I've been noticing. Like, okay, well, there's a whole nother group that has supply chain attack frameworks, and there was something else that they created that said supply chain. So why not put it under the bigger umbrella of supply chain integrity? So, okay.
Yeah, I think that just that general feedback is worthwhile to just keep bubbling up to the TAC and general OpenSSF.
That feedback to supply. Oh, not to TAC.
Yeah, I was actually looking to maybe get a call with Amkar, just to kind of like, you know, this is just more of like from a personal standpoint of like, hey, you know, as somebody who does a lot of stuff in the OpenSSF, here's just some general thoughts, here's some things I'm seeing, and just wanted to highlight some of that. But yeah, I think the main things are, right, like, which I think is something I'm hoping comes down here is like, right, you know, we want to have autonomy. I actually watched a really interesting video about this, about Spotify's culture. And the idea here is you want to give folks, like at a high level, we want from the TAC and OpenSSF itself, we want the vision, but we want autonomy on how to get there. You know, as opposed to, you know, having like being told exactly what to do or whatever, but like we want to make sure stuff is aligned and all that good stuff. And so I think that's super valuable. And then also better understanding of like, great, what is the, like, we would want at some level the TAC to help us define our scope, right? Like we want to define our own scope, but we want the TAC to at least say, hey, there's a little bit of overlap here with this other group, and that makes sense. Just stay coordinated with that group, right? Like that would be super valuable because, you know, as we've found multiple times before, is we found like somebody starts doing some sort of threat model and we're like, wait a second, why are they doing that and not including us, right? And a lot of times we start doing something and somebody says, why is supply chain integrity working on this and not the tooling group? Or why is, you know, and
that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I can never make those meetings. It literally conflicts every 2 weeks with the showcase meeting that we have for our sprints. So, any last thoughts on the TAC update? Okay. So what I was thinking, folks, was to go through, I know this TAC sign off, we could probably update it with the meeting notes from today. I would like to talk more about the videos and what we want to put in there. Mike and I talked to Jennifer Bly, and you know, although they don't have somebody, you know, deep skilled video editing, they have some folks that have, you know, some stuff or maybe could pick up things quickly. So it's not super polished, but it's better than us doing a screen share, right? And recording that and sending it off. So we need to start thinking about what we want. I know institutional trust is not enough. That was Marcella that wanted to work through that, but I'm not opposed to providing feedback for either of these. So what are people's thoughts on that? Yay, nay?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, most of my feedback is the same feedback I sort of gave in that meeting, which is just like, hey, definitely we should have some of these things. I know a lot of folks are asking for something like some webinars because I think there's like a little bit of beyond the deep dive in Salsa, like a lot of folks are asking for stuff like They're really asking for things like, what is salsa? Okay, now that I know what salsa is it something I care about? If it is something I care about, where do I get started? And I think for a lot of folks, the confusion is mostly between the like, okay, I have an idea of what salsa is, but why do I care about it? Like
Mhm.
the why do I care about it isn't clear enough, and then the where do I get started is not clear enough. I think over time, like there's a separate problem in some of the things that I think we had discussed as well, which is working on salsa. Like a lot of folks, there's not a lot of tools out there yet, right? And so a lot of folks are like, great, but how do I do this on Jenkins, right? And the problem here is like, you know, getting a bunch of volunteers to go and do a bunch of work on a thing that maybe they don't necessarily really, you know, like on that end, like of like, here's an implementation guide on, let's say, Jenkins for salsa. You know, we're all volunteers here. And so if it's somebody who's an expert in Jenkins and has been doing this, they're like, oh yeah, we want to open source that guide or whatever. But for folks who are not using Jenkins, they're going to be like, yeah, it's not really on, you know, something I'm super focused on. So I think that's like another concern is just how do you get folks who are like, yeah, I want to write an implementation guide, but a lot of the feedback we got is in stuff that I do not want to make an implementation guide for.
So I caught part of that. Sorry, while I was trying to log in.
Yeah, no problem.
I was
yeah.
listening to it, but I definitely was not documenting.
Oh no, yeah, no problem.
I was looking for my password. So I'm gonna try to remember stuff that you said. So one is, you know, what was it? I remember hearing, why do I care about salsa? Right?
Yeah. So well, so there's a little bit of why do I care about salsa? So that's one thing. And then how do I get started? Right? Like,
yeah,
you know, a basic implementation guide. But then that second piece, what makes it what makes that a little complicated is everybody has different needs for their their build and their secure build. And so a lot of folks are asking stuff like, hey, I use Jenkins. How do I do this? And the problem that we found is even though a lot of folks are asking for, oh, we'd love to have a salsa implementation guide for something like Jenkins, you know, or you know, TeamCity. Great. Who's going to do that? Right? Like a lot of folks right now are, you know, if there is somebody in the community who's an expert in Jenkins and would be willing to do that, great. But a lot of folks are saying like, look, I have enough time, you know, I have enough things, or I'm not an expert in Jenkins, or hey, if I write a implementation guide on Jenkins, I'm not doing this other thing, and I'd much rather be doing this other thing. So that's kind of where some of the other stuff has come in of like, how do we also get the industry to come in and say, look, maybe we talk to the CloudBees folks and say, hey, CloudBees, you know, salsa's growing in size and yada yada, and we'd love to get something like a Jenkins implementation guide for salsa, because you know some of the existing members just don't have the time to focus on it or don't have the expertise in Jenkins, you know, to do that work.
Okay, that makes sense. But we can start with GitHub Actions, right?
Yes, we can get started with GitHub Actions. I think the thing that I'm trying to say is a lot of folks have come out and said, yeah, we're not using GitHub Actions, so where's my Jenkins, or where's my TeamCity, or where's my whatever.
Yes. Yeah, I want to, like, I completely get that, because we don't use GitHub Actions internally. But maybe while we're trying to get those people to help, we can get started with the other stuff. And then maybe by the time we publish those, then we can publish the Jenkins or TeamCity or Tecton. I mean, we can put call out internally, right, at IBM or, you know, wherever. Hey, is anybody interested in showing this off? So we could potentially do it internally. We can do like LinkedIn. We can do any Slack channel on OpenSSF to say, hey, who's interested in showing this off? And then we set up a meeting with them to see if it's truly what we think it is, right? We need to make sure they're conforming to 1.0 and not 0.1, right? So I don't know, what thoughts on that? This is really like a 2A. So there's a how do you get started? These are the use cases. Why do I care about salsa? What else? Should we do something preliminary? Or not preliminary, but before we even talk about salsa, should we do one on the SCI working group? And say, you know, these are our pillars or sub-projects, whatever you want to call them. And during the first series, we'll talk about salsa. And then we'll, because it's more than just salsa, but I feel like maybe we should emphasize the working group first and then dig into salsa. What are folks' thoughts on that?
So I think that might be interesting because that's actually something that CNCF does a lot with their like people will often record videos, usually for stuff like KubeCon, of like what are the latest new features or whatever for, or like, hey, here's a new project and what is the scope of our project, what is our goals, and it kind of like, you know, they show it during the keynotes. But I think something like that also would be super valuable just to kind of have on YouTube as like, you know, for folks who are, you know, hey, once again, not reading or whatever, or just, you know, like, where do I get started? You know, what do you guys do? Oh, okay, cool. You know, here's that, here's a, you know, a short 3-minute YouTube video of like, you know, these SCI working group, here's our, you know, our scope and our goals. And, you know, here are the literal things we're working on today. And here's like our most recent big things, something like that.
Okay, yeah. And then, okay, so I'll create a different ticket for that. Because that'll be kind of like a precursor to the, you know, why do I care about salsa? So create an issue for this separately. I can't spell. I knew it. I spelled it right the first time. So what else in terms of, because the use cases, what we want to be careful of is the videos not being too long. So are we going to have to break it up into different stages? Like, yes, there's a how to get started, but maybe there's a how to get started A, B, and C for each of these. So just trying to make sure that we, again, think of the micro video concept. So can we condense the how to get started in 5 minutes? I'm not sure that we can. So how do we break it up? Thoughts, folks? Quiet bunch today. Because there's the consumer side, right? But then there's also the implement. Oh, I forgot the personas. Implementer. This is a producer. This is the producer. Consumer, and there was another one. We changed the.
Yeah, it was there was, oh she's now I'm forgetting as well.
Oh wait, not vendors.
No, I think it was under is it terminology? No.
Producer, consumer.
Yeah.
There. Oh, here. These are the roles, right? Okay, so then I'm going to. So yeah, we should maybe from the how to get started, it needs to be persona based. I don't want to get too, you know, complicated here, but that is going to matter on the how to get started, right? So that should show that preview. Yeah, producer. So we're probably going to focus on the producer first, right? So the persona. producer. There's the verifier and persona consumer. Do we even want to touch infrastructure provider?
I don't think so at this. I don't think it's super important at this time. I think like actually one of the things we might want to consider is just there might be two classes of the producer persona. There's going to be at some level it is sort of like the infrastructure provider, but I think there's going to be so actually because this is actually something that came up a few times in some of the conversations, is that like there is some overlap between producer and the infrastructure provider, because one of the problems is like, hey, if you have a company that's not going to be using a service, like, so they're not going to be using GitHub Actions, they're going to be using their own thing, then they are both producer and infrastructure provider. Unless, you know, depending on, you know, who owns the stuff internally, you know, you might have a different department owns the build tool itself and another team owns the usage of the build tool. Because but I do think actually at some level, actually now that I think about it, the infrastructure provider, because the infrastructure provider is going in our context, right, I believe is not just purely the person, you know, so the producer in this context is the person who is writing the code and wants to use a salsa build, right? So they would go and say, okay, I'm using GitHub Actions, and GitHub Actions is salsa conformant. So I get to just sort of use that and I get salsa provenance, right? So for the producer end, there's not a lot of stuff there. The problem comes when you have a producer who also runs their own build system, right? So I think that's kind of where it is, where I wouldn't focus right now, at least on the infrastructure provider, who is the like, okay, you're running, you know, you're trying to develop a salsa build tool as a service. Like, I don't think we need to focus too much on that, but I do think we need to reach out to folks on, hey, if you are, you know, running a build, this is what a simple build looks like, you know, at the high level of like, you should be securing your build system, whether it is Jenkins or TeamCity or GitHub Actions or whatever, and you should be doing these things, and then you should be generating this data, and that's kind of because yeah, it's gonna be super easy if it's just a GitHub Actions thing, right? Because then we could just say, yeah, you use GitHub Actions, you use this thing, and you're fine.
Yeah. So the next question I have is, like, we know this is available in GitHub Actions, and then if we don't have anything for Jenkins and Tecton or TeamCity, etc., then that almost starts to go into this persona, right? Because you're assuming that it's already in place and you're just going to go use it. But I suspect that there's going to be some sort of scripts that need to happen first before anybody can use these tools, right? I need to say it in a different way.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah. So right now we know we can do a salsa build with GitHub Actions, right? But we can't just go implement Jenkins and say, yeah, we can do a salsa build with Jenkins. I don't think there is a configuration or a template of some sort that says, if you use this, you're good. I think we still have to create that. Not us, but in general, we have to create that.
Yeah, the industry, or and so this is something that I was hoping to get out in the next couple of weeks, but it might be a little longer now. So I'm working on a tool which I plan to open source that would just sort of work with whatever CI tool, right? Which would split up CI between CI and the build. So you would have Jenkins still do the CI, but you wouldn't have Jenkins do the build. You would have Jenkins call the secure salsa builder. And that might help out and also help solve a lot of these things. And I do plan to open source it. I'm just doing a bunch of work on that first. But the basic, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, because I think the thing that I think one of the key things that I think kind of comes out of a lot of the issues with why salsa is maybe a little bit more complicated for certain ecosystems as it is than it is for others is because everybody just sort of loads everything into just purely the CI and like, okay, I can't move off of Jenkins because my CI system, downloads the source code, scans it, does all these security things. It then sends this over to here where it runs QA tests, and then it runs a build, and then it does this, and then it runs these other tests, and it runs the deployment. Well, that piece where you actually ran the build, that's the only thing that Salsa cares about, right? Like, eventually we might want to have Salsa for the entire supply chain, right? But we already said like, yeah, then we might not want to do that. Right now, we're super focused on the build. We plan to be very focused on the source code and those sorts of things. But if we can get folks to say, great, well, if you had Jenkins or your Team City or whatever, call a secure builder, and that secure builder just takes in the source code, takes in the dependencies, and does it in a secure, salsified way, and then just replies back to Jenkins with, yep, the build's over, then you've now salsified Jenkins without actually needing to do much effort. So that's one of the key goals I have. And I'm mostly done with something, and it's also mostly done with something that would allow folks to plug in what they feel is comfortable, whether or not they plug in a container-based build or they plug in a secure enclave, Intel SGX, super secure build, or they plug in just a VM or a process or whatever. So that's something I'm working on, and hoping to get at least a beta or a demo version of it out in the coming weeks once I'm able to type again.
Okay,
That
got
sounds
it.
really good.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm sure it'll be very popular, Michael.
Thanks. And this is something that I just I don't want to over-index on this thing, but one of the things that I'm doing with it is it's all an open API specification, which would allow folks to then just write their own plugins for that thing as they see fit. So if they're like, hey, I want to add this new, even more secure build, great. Salsa consists of source and dependencies as inputs, and the output is one or more artifacts and a Salsa attestation, or plus other things like an SBOM or whatever. But those are the things, great. As long as I have an API, as long as you sort of do that, you are now Salsa, right? And then it becomes whatever that thing is that doing all the right things from a security perspective? And then that's more on the actual consumer to say, yep, I trust this, but not that.
okay. Yeah, that would be really cool to see. So definitely keep us updated once it goes live. The only, I think, concern I have is, and this isn't necessarily for like the open source maintainers, but if you're calling a secure builder, where is that builder? Who owns it? That whole trust, right, model. Now you have my source code because you're building it. Well, you have to trust that builder. So yeah, that's a different topic.
Yeah, but I think that's worthwhile to sort of say is like, hey, it's up to you to do two things. What? Oh no, my headphones just died.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it does two things. One is you need to sort of figure out, like, if you use a service or something like that, you need to trust which service do I trust for when I'm producing. This is both from a producer and a consumer standpoint, is like, and then in addition to that, you need to trust whether or not, like, especially with some of the claims of like, hey, I ran this using the GitHub Actions builder. Great. Well, when I consume it, even though it's Salsa, I don't trust it, or whatever, right? I think those are two things that need to be done. And then I think from the end of like the thing I'm building as well is like, yeah, different folks are going to say different things, right? Where like, and I think that's kind of why when thinking about the build, if we can kind of keep it super small and say, I have a very tiny API that's sort of like a Jenkins, itself, but all it can do is run salsa builds. So you don't have to worry about like, well, you misconfigured it, and so it's not salsa anymore. It's like, nope, it can only be salsa because it's only configured to do salsa. So if you tell it to do something other than salsa, it just won't work. And I think that sort of thing, you know, you go in and you say, great, now if I trust that you're running that infrastructure correctly and you're not lying to me, right? Because anybody could lie that, you know, yeah, I'm using the GitHub Actions provider. Are you really, or are you using something that looks like it, right? There's lots of ways to sort of, you know, and depending on, you know, that's where some of the other trust stuff like anyway, never mind.
Yeah,
Don't go down
yeah.
that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I know there's institutional trust stuff that Marcella was talking about. So we might have a different set of videos about trust, right? And so we can handle all that, but at least, you know, we might say, okay, for this demo, for this video, you have to assume trust of the secure builder if we're going to use your CI tool, which I feel like by the time we do release this video, it'll be available so that we could show something like this off. Yeah, so yeah, this is good content. What about the verifier persona? I guess you would assume that they have received a, you know, a software package / product / project, right? They have some artifacts, one being the salsa provenance, but then there's also the VSA. This is something else that we've talked about. Do we want to separate those two into a different video, or do we want to keep it in the one?
We might want to, like, at a very, very high level, just sort of say, yeah, there's also going to be VSA, which is intended to be for, you know, consuming elements of, you know, like without getting into too many details, because I do think that VSA is a whole other set of things that takes some time to grok, and most like, and the other problem too is most tools right now don't support the VSA. So even if we do start to really get into the weeds with it, people are going to be like, wait, but I looked at this tool and it doesn't provide VSA yet. So I think on that end, just like at a high level, talk about the concepts. But then if we get down to like here's how you use the GitHub Actions thing, we're not going to really get into the VSA yet, right? Because I need to double check, but I don't think it supports VSA yet. I think there's a couple of open PRs and design docs to get that in. Okay,
so that could be a different video then. We don't want to confuse people with VSA, like, oh, they talked about this, but they didn't show it. So we could just focus on the salsa provenance. Would it be an in toto attestation?
So the VSA would be an in toto attestation. Yeah, that's the way it's set up right now. It's what do they call it? IT6 or whatever, but it's, yeah, in toto attestation.
What about the salsa provenance?
Yeah, that's also in toto. And I think the thing that's worth highlighting, at least at a high level, is we don't require that people use purely in toto attestations, but given that it's the thing, it's essentially the de facto because it's what we've been using. That's sort of where folks have been focused on. But like, I think it's worth at least highlighting to certain folks, like especially if you have large organizations that are like, look, I'm not distributing my salsa provenance. I'm only including all my salsa provenance internally, and I'm using all these internal XML documents for how I do this. Okay, cool. You could still implement it. You would have to write the custom logic and the custom code. I think that's worthwhile at least highlighting that, because I think in the documentation, we specifically say, like, we highly suggest in toto just because it's the one that we're building all the tooling around in the open source space, but there's nothing that stops you from using whatever you want, especially for internal use cases and those sorts of things.
So quick question, and excuse the ignorance here on this topic. I don't think in toto is the same thing as using like Sigstore or Recore or anything like that, right?
So it's kind of just a different like thing. So like the idea would be at the very low level, right? You have things that are signed, right?
Yep.
And so when Toto does the signing, so sorry, not Sigstore does the signing. In Toto is the document that is being signed. And so in our case, it just so happens that the Sigstore tooling works really well with Intoto, where you could just sort of say, here's an Intoto document, Sigstore sign it, and it understands how to sign Intoto statements and turn them into what's referred to as Dizzy envelopes, where Dizzy envelope is just the signature plus the actual Intoto attestation. And so you can think of it as just, it's a wrapper around the Intoto statement. And then the Intoto statement consists of a header, which is just, what is this Intoto statement about? Right? What is the subject? So in the case of Salsa and VSA, it would be like, here is the thing, here's the artifact and the hash of the artifact that I'm talking about. And then the predicate, in this case, the predicate would be either VSA or Salsa, which then that is itself like a specification around, okay, here are the keys and values, or the fields of the document of that I'm, the metadata that I'm actually expressing.
Okay. And the reason why I asked this is because we can do like a highlight of OpenSSF projects to do the verification, right? And so we can do a quick, like, okay, here's Sigstore, here's Intoto, and then we have Salsa provenance, right? So we can show like, these are the 3 technologies that are hooked in together to be able to do the verifier. So that could be kind of the opening. And then you go into the actual use case scenario. So that brings me to another point that we want to do. Do we want to do this? This one, it definitely is, Salsa, right? But there's nothing else in here, right? Other than Salsa. Unless we do something like this, but this is a outside of OpenSSF.
Yeah. Obviously depending, I might want to contribute whatever I'm building to OpenSSF long term, but at least for right now, I don't want to like get into that when it's just, but I think also maybe something as a follow on from this as well is maybe to do something like a Salsa the hard way. Something like, hey, for folks who are like, great, I don't use Sigstore, I don't use any of these things, like just tell me the general concepts of how I do these things. And like show me like, okay, you're signing with, let's just say for right now, like you're signing with Sigstore, but you're not showing me, because right now, even though we're signing with Sigstore via the GitHub action and we're signing with Sigstore via Tecton chains and a lot of these other things, like showing somebody, okay, well, I generate this thing for my build, right? So let's just assume for a second, I do not have any builder, I do not have anything, I'm building locally, right? How would I still sort of generate that same provenance, and how would I still generate it? Let's just say for a second here, completely manually, so that somebody who's reading through this goes and understands the concepts of like, oh, okay, you're filling out the information in this document, then you're signing that document, and then you're moving that document. So if I'm building my own tool, I would need to do those things. I would need to pull in information about the dependencies, pull in information about the source, pull in information about the build command, and then run that in a secure way, right? And we're not going to talk about how that necessarily gets run outside of like, here's maybe a shell script just to kind of show you, here's it actually running. And then I sign that document and then I publish that document. So somebody who's reading through this can go and understand, okay, if I want to build this myself for, internal CI tool X, these are the things, these are the steps I actually need to take. And once again, that's kind of more of an advanced kind of thing.
Yeah. So that could be a, how do I get started advanced? Basically, you're rolling up your sleeve and doing it all on your own. Okay, so I've copied that. And I came back up here because I was thinking, well, if it's just salsa in this part, and again, if we can have your CI tool, we can mention it as well. If there's not enough for the opening, we can also talk about the mobilization plan and why salsa, or link back to the why do I care, right? But I do think we should have like a opening of highlighting something at the beginning to set the stage of why or what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so any other thoughts from folks on these two before we move on to consumer?
No, one thing I wanted to interject on Melba is, you keep saying, oh, are we going to put that in a different video or not? I think this, you should kind of postpone this decision process. Look at the kind of things you want to touch on, and then maybe it's part of the editing afterwards, actually, is how much can we fit into a certain amount of time that you're willing that you're targeting. Because at this point, just having bullets on the slide is going to make it very hard to know how long this is actually going to take, right? And I think you have to defer a little bit of that decision making to later, once you have a bit more information about actually how much time it takes.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, I think we're definitely trying to keep it to like 3 to 5 minutes. We want these to be micro videos. So I think some things we can say, yeah, this has to be a different video, but you're right. Like some of this stuff right here, we may not even be able to get in 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah,
exactly.
So yeah.
One of the things that has been suggested to me now that I'm also mostly done with a book on supply chain security, and the folks who came out with marketing have been asking us to do, asking me to do some stuff. One of the things they asked was like, or actually a bunch of things that a few of the marketing people I've been speaking to have all said is like, it might make sense to build it out in a long form first, and then to like what Arno was saying was like almost like splice it up, like go and pull out little bits and turn that into like, so you end up with both the long form content for folks who want to have it, as well as the short form content there, so that you get it in multiple different multiple different ways, where it's like, okay, yeah, for the folks who just want a bite-sized thing, great, here it is. If for folks who want the full blast of like, here's an hour-long webinar on salsa, you can also consume it, and we don't have to, let's say, remake the content each time. We just maybe need to, edit the content, splice in certain things. And we might still need to, in certain cases say, you know what, we can't really, splice it, so we'll have to re-record something and, whatever. But
Yeah.
I think that sort of thing is from a lot of, so we don't have to repeat ourselves and duplicate work.
No, yeah, that's a good point. I'm wondering, given time, right? I know time is an issue. If there's like an hour-long video, and I don't know that we even have a time to do an hour-long video, right? We have 3 minutes. Like, okay, let's just do this little piece, 3 minutes. But to like set up the whole thing, if we can do it in one go and slice it up, great. But I'm cautious that we may not even be able to allocate that much time to doing the full, long form content. We could probably put the chunks together in some way, but I think that's my only concern.
Yeah, I like your idea, Mike, but I'm also a bit concerned about, I don't know who's got the editing skills to do that, and that it ends up, pretty good.
Yeah.
And this takes time in and of itself, right? The editing alone.
Yeah, and I think this is highly based off our conversation with Jennifer, is like, if OpenSSF could provide us with some editors, then it might be much easier. Yeah. And in fact, I think we want to, if we could get an editor, run the idea by an editor and say, hey, we would love to sort of record this in some way where we could reuse some of the content in different places, and what's the best way to do that?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we spoke with Jennifer last week. They're trying to hire a more advanced video editing person. They're even thinking about, subcontracting out to do some of this stuff, including like webinars. But we told them we don't need things to be super polished. We just need it to be better than us doing a screen share. And so she thinks that they would be able to help. So if we provide like the script, right? If we provide some, some guidance, that they could work with us, but we first have to figure out what we want to talk about. And then she can get together with us and that person that she has in mind to do some of the preliminary stuff to see if it'll work. So yeah, we're definitely not going to be video editing. At least I'm not.
All right.
Yeah, we don't have the time.
Yeah, that's yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. These
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And I posted this because I didn't want to lose. Sometimes GitHub will reset or something on me, and then I lose everything that I typed up. So I posted it so not to lose it. And Josh said, and I thought about this, but I understand why we need to postpone it. Should we focus on infrastructure provider centric messaging to start? It's the ideal path to adoption is enabling a feature your existing tooling and infrastructure has implemented. So thoughts on that?
It rings really well with me, which is that I feel like we're spending a lot of effort doing outreach to people that will then say, this is great, let me do it. And then they go find out that none of their tooling works with it yet.
Okay. So this is a, let me quote the plus one from that. Brandon, are you on here, Brandon? Is it
It might not be on the
Mitchell?
issue. I can throw a little thumbs up on it.
Okay, okay. Up through this.
Boink.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, I remember that username now. Sudo Mitch. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Just
If
don't
you
forget
do
the M.
yeah, if you do a fast one, that's why I was like, okay, let me make sure I'm writing this right. I like this idea. Folks will want to their tooling. Or stuck. Sorry, just paraphrasing. Stuck. Okay. What about consumer? Or do we want to tackle infrastructure provider before consumer? It says here, let me open this, the preview, so that way people can see the consumer definition. This almost looks like verifier for provenance. So would these be two of the same?
Well, so this kind of ties back into a little bit of the infrastructure provider end. Like the verifier at some level is the verifying tool. And so that might also be different depending on the there's a lot of overlap here, right? Because the same thing was sort of like infrastructure provider and producer, right? Those two are potentially linked because the producer says, hey, I want to provide salsa attestation. So I'm going to either build infrastructure or use an infrastructure provider who can provide salsa attestations. And then a consumer is going to say, hey, I want to use salsa. I want to use salsa backed software. So I'm going to go and pick either a verification service or a verification tool, most likely, to sort of do that verification. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just wondering if it warrants another video.
If I was to draw this on the salsa.dev diagram where you got the producer, the build tool in the middle, the consumer on the right-hand side of that, I would kind of look at the producer as what's on the diagram already. The verifier might be part of the dependency ingestion component. The consumer is on the right-hand side of the diagram saying we've now consumed it. And the infrastructure provider is someone who's writing the tools for all of this. Am I looking at this same way other people are looking at it?
I feel like the verifier, it doesn't necessarily have to be
Right.
only the dependencies, but of the package itself. So it could be over here too.
Yeah.
So that's
The consumer role
where-
itself is it's awkwardly defined because it's the part, reading the description we've got, a party that uses software provided by a producer may verify provenance for the software they consume, may delegate, yada, yada. Whereas the verifier is saying, in the example case, it's talking about business software ingestion system. And when I see that, I'm thinking, okay, that kind of fits it on that one side to me when I look at that example. But that is just
Yeah.
an example.
Yeah. Oh, wrong one. So thoughts on the video or because I could see the verification of like, an auditor, right? Verifying something. But then from a consumption standpoint, you would want to verify that artifact before. But in either case, the process is the same. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter if you are consuming it or not.
the consumer is definitely going to have to do some kind of verification when they're running this stuff. So I'm trying to look at how you separate the verifier out from the consumer in this picture. Non-trivial.
Yeah. Different from a video perspective. I guess the only thing that one would do is say, okay, verify before ingesting the component. So you can show it maybe more over here. Right? Like you as actually, no, you're consuming the package, but you can also use the package for another package. Recursive dependencies. Because this could be the final for that package, or it could just be put into something else, like, with the dependencies. And so as you are consuming multiple packages to build something bigger, right, you can have that verification step from an automation standpoint. So we could do a video on that, but
Honestly, when I compare the roles to the diagram, the producer and consumer are flipped in the picture because the consumer is often the developer on the left-hand side, and the producer is often the output of whatever the pipeline created.
depends. Think of
Yeah,
a brand new project, right? Think of a brand new project. It doesn't have anything, right? The source is all custom. It's not relying on anything outside, right? That is the producer creating that software. So if it doesn't have any outside dependencies or any projects, this whole process could be the producer doing this to generate that new software.
But they're also, for the non-new cases, which I think is
yes,
vast majority of them, they're consuming a lot of this upstream.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I mean, there's some kind of an arrow missing, if you will, between consumer and producer. There's a loop there, right? As you go through the supply chain, you basically.
When I drew this, I added an extra arrow from dependencies up to source, just to indicate that the source is pinning to wherever your dependencies are.
Yeah, and so in that regard, the producer can indeed be also a consumer with regard to the dependencies they have.
I think the reason why it's drawn this way is because in theory, you should pull your dependencies during build, not necessarily from the internet, but you shouldn't necessarily have to have your dependencies in the source file, sure, but you wouldn't actually have that code or that package until build time. I think that's why it's built this way.
But I think it's because it's the smallest kind of, link in the chain you can represent that has all the different elements.
Yeah, we tried for the Sterling tool chain to make this just a linear picture, and I like this also one a lot better. That it's showing that it's circular, it's showing where the dependencies actually get pulled in. It feels like a much better representation of what really happens.
Oh, I just noticed the time. So we have 3 minutes left. So what do we do about the consumer persona?
If we're breaking it up, I would push that off till later. It's one of those, if you build it, they will come, and they might start asking for stuff before we've had a chance to build it.
Other comments, thoughts? None? Am I getting you right before lunch or maybe right after lunch, depending on if you're in the East Coast? Going into the lunch coma. My lunch is coming up. So.
For what it's worth, I'm just
There's
right
dinner.
before dinner. So.
Yeah, dinner. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead.
At the very least, I don't think we're going to solve it in 1 minute.
No, we're not. Yeah, let me save this. And I can always.
The thing is, the consumer and the verifier are not often, exclusive, right? It's often the same. It's like the consumer, you want the consumer to act as the verifier as part of the consumption of the artifacts they want to use. And so I think what I would want to say about the consumer is mostly already addressed in the verifier part.
And with that, we are at time. I think this has been great progress. So yeah, okay. Well, thanks, folks. If you want to comment on not only the deep dive, but there's also the institutional trust one, feel free to start commenting on what you think we can talk about. So that way we can start chomping away at this and getting it in front of Jennifer to help with, creating of videos, etc. So, yeah, thanks for joining, folks. Appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, Melba.
All right,
have a good
thank
day.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.